Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next panel, Creating Capacity and Capability, the role of regional resources in turning the tide for manufacturing. Our panelists are Mr. Leo Gerard, International President, United Steelworkers; Dr. Thomas E. Mason, Director, Oak Ridge National Laboratory; Dr. Annette Parker, President, South Central College; Ms. Jean Redfield, President and Chief Executive Officer, NextEnergy; and Mr. Phillip A. Singerman, Ph.D., Associate Director for Innovation and Industry Services, National Institute of Standards and Technology, U.S. Department of Commerce. And please welcome our moderator, Mr. Harold L. Sirkin, Senior Partner, the Boston Consulting Group.
We have a great panel here for you today, and I'd like to just start getting into it. I know that we're running a bit late and lunch is looming large, but I think we have a very important topic to discuss, and it is about regional assets. We all tend to focus on the national assets of this country, which are very vast, but when you start to add up all we have from our 50 states, we can basically see that we have equal or even more power when we can utilize the regional assets and put them together along with the federal assets. Jean, I think you have a perspective on the regional assets, so I'd like you to share that as we begin our panel discussion.
Sure. I mean, when we started to prepare for this panel, the first topic of conversation came up was, what do we mean by regional, and what assets are we talking about? The way we do our work at NextEnergy, we're an innovation center to drive job creation and investment in advanced energy technologies in Michigan, is very local. We're predominantly state-driven. And we've been working hard with DOE resources to branch out to be regional at the level of Midwest. Ohio, Michigan for Clean Energy Roadmap, Illinois, Michigan for the National Incubator Initiative. But when we're working with companies in the energy space and transportation space, regional for them is NAFTA, not Michigan. So one of the challenges that we've got is how do regional assets actually get resourced and have the both span of capability and ability to have impact with global companies. So there's a little bit of a mismatch. We're excited about the work that the DOE is doing to start to thread together these regional assets so that the Michigans and the Ohios and the Illinois start to form common cluster initiatives, common levels of impact with our startups, our small and medium enterprises, and our globally headquartered world-class companies all working together. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is what assets. And the exciting thing about this panel is all the various assets that we work with are represented here. For us, the assets are, of course, IP, but that's just the beginning. Talent, infrastructure, the connectivity with the existing global leaders in the various industry verticals that we serve. Those are all assets that we as a regional incubator have learned to work well with.
Jean, just one thing to follow up on that. What are the assets from Illinois, which is where I come from, and Michigan, where you come from? How do they work together now because of this partnership?
Well, one of the current programs that we're working on with a partner in Chicago, Clean Energy Trust. Clean Energy Trust has a great history of working with the venture community in a way that NextEnergy hasn't. We work well with the universities, we work well with the national labs, we work well with the very large OEMs in our region. And so partnering with Clean Energy Trust brings another slice of the pie into it. It also expands the industry base that we're working with. Michigan, we tend to work heavily in the automotive space, so all of the transportation technologies and the energy balance of plant technologies related to transportation systems. But we also have a huge lighting cluster. How does that lighting cluster get better integrated into the built environment leaders like Schneider Electric that's headquartered in Chicagoland? So beginning to partner at that level as well.
And there's a lot of other things we need, of course, to partner. And Annette, let me ask you, you've recently taken over the Minnesota college systems, I think, overall. And I think one of the key questions that everyone in business at least talks about is how do we get the right workforce? So Annette, can you share a little bit about what you're doing to make sure that Minnesota, and for that matter, the rest of the country, is able to have the right workforce?
Well, you know, I serve right now on President Obama's Advanced Manufacturing Partnership. And I believe that the lessons that we learned about the work that needs to be done to make sure that we have a skilled pipeline of highly skilled, I'd say middle skilled jobs. What we're doing in Minnesota is making sure that employers, whether they're in the Iron Range in northern Minnesota to food production in southern Minnesota, have the skill sets that they need for highly skilled technicians. And that we're also making sure that a pipeline is available from, for our engineering pipelines as well. And so the MnSCU system is made up of 24 community colleges and 7 universities that have 54 campuses throughout Minnesota. And we support 430,000 students a year. So what we're doing is making sure that we follow the strategies that the president has identified for advanced manufacturing, making sure there's modules for the military, that there's stackable credentials, the national portable credentials in advanced manufacturing. So it doesn't matter where you get your instruction, if you're in Bemidji or if you're in Mankato, where I reside, that the students have the same skill set to make sure employers understand what those skills are. When they leave us, they're ready for work.
And how do you ensure that this happens? What are the things you're doing to make it very clear that Minnesota is going to produce some of the finest people in the workforce?
Well, we've identified, for example, in manufacturing, for the manufacturing sector, what schools, we have 12 of our MnSCU 2-year colleges that have strong manufacturing programs. They are partnered up with us to make sure that the curriculum is consistent and aligned to the national standards identified by the Manufacturing Institute, so that every student has those same skills. We're also working with 2 centers of excellence in manufacturing in Minnesota, 360 that's in Bemidji, and then MnSCME that's at Minnesota State University, Mankato. And so we also make sure that we have a pipeline of those that are interested. Maybe they start in a technical program like mechatronics, but want to be an engineer, that they have stackable credentials with multiple entry and exit points that lead to a highly skilled technician or an engineer if they so desire. And so the MnSCU, the Minnesota State College and University Board of Trustees, has taken this to a state level to make sure that we have an initiative. We have an initiative called Charting the Future for a Prosperous Minnesota. And in that, we have competency and certification and credit for prior learning initiative. And that initiative will make sure that credit is transferable across all 31 institutions.
That's great, because having different accreditation and different standards make it very difficult, but it sounds like you've done an incredible job getting those standards to be really standardized.
Yes. For example, one of our employers, 3M, they have facilities throughout Minnesota. They shouldn't have to dig deep into our catalogs to identify what competencies they might need from Alexandria Tech in Alexandria, Minnesota, and what that would mean in Fairmont, Minnesota.
Leo, you are the head of the United Steelworkers Union, and you've been partnering, I know, with a lot of different companies to make sure that our country, not only here in the U.S., but also in Canada, because I think the union covers there, are able to sort of work together. And I'd like to hear some of the things that you've been able to do along with the companies and the workforce to make sure that we have a very skilled workers training in the steel mills. Those are clearly very high-tech jobs, although people don't necessarily see them that way. But I'd like to hear about how this all works and what your union is doing and how you're partnering.
Well, that's a large question with a large answer. That little bit of change in my thinking. Our union created something called the Institute for Career Development over 25 years ago. It's a labor management partnership and started off in the steel industry. We've now expanded that partnership to a number of other industries. Although we're called the Steelworkers Union, we're a diversified union that represents workers in the energy sector, in the paper sector, in the tire sector, in the glass sector, in the aluminum sector, and steel, just to name some of them. And so we've developed the Institute for Career Development. But through that, we've done work with the Blue-Green Alliance to partner with certain companies. As an example, we partnered with ArcelorMittal to capture waste energy and are training what we call the steelworker of the future. But in capturing that waste energy, we're recycling it. That was a small investment that ArcelorMittal made of about $38 million. And the energy saving on that is about the equivalent of 60,000 cars off the road. We've worked with the paper industry to work on a boiler mat with EPA to make sure that we met the environmental standards but yet created jobs. That means we have to enhance the skills of our membership in those workplaces. And one of the things that concerns me when we talk about advanced manufacturing, it's not just 3D manufacturing. If you go into a steel mill or into a paper mill, I'll use steel as the example. You drive by a steel mill and you see all the rolls of steel. Almost every one of those rolls is scientifically engineered for the product it's going to. If you're working in the operations center of the steel mill, you're going to get more training than an airline pilot. If you're going to build bridges, we need to build orthotropic bridges, and we need to make sure that manufacturing is happening in America. So it's not just the skills, it's the financial commitment, it's all of that brought together. We have thousands and thousands of jobs that can be created by infrastructure. But as I said to you a while ago, I don't want to rely on imported solar panels or imported wind turbines any more than I wanted to rely on imported oil. And so we've been working with the Great Lakes Wind Organization to develop the supply chain for wind turbines. We're trying to do that so that we can have domestic manufacturers making those. And again, that means to enhance their skills. So we work with the community colleges. Brag a little bit about coming from southwestern Pennsylvania. We have some of the best education programs in the country with universities and community colleges, and we're partnering with them as well. My last point on it is when I was in high school, in order to graduate high school, you had to have 1 semester of shop every year, 4 semesters of shop, where you learn to work with your hands. Now one of the problems is our high schools, most of them don't do that. And we spend too much time trying to graduate financial engineers when we should be graduating mechanical engineers.
Exactly, exactly. Any thoughts, Leo, on how we can change that? Because I think that is one of the keys to our competitiveness as a nation.
I think that the country is coming to realize that you can't sustain your leadership in the world if you don't make anything. Mm-hmm. And obviously one of the things that troubles me personally in our union institutionally is a ongoing manufacturing trade deficit in the world. And I view that as a wealth transfer, but maybe more important or equally important, a technology transfer. And I think that we need as a nation an industrial strategy, which means working with our community college, working with the financial sector, working with our industries, and putting it all that together. Of the OECD countries, and you travel quite a bit, so you'll know. If I'm wrong, you can tell me. But of the OECD countries, we're one of the only countries, if not one of the few countries, that doesn't have an industrial strategy to make sure that we're advancing our manufacturing in a way that makes sure that people have jobs for the future. I'll just close my comment by saying that it's really, really important that we have a regional strategy that's complemented by a national strategy. I'll use the example of Pennsylvania. When Governor Rendell was in Pennsylvania, he had a renewable energy standard. That allowed us to attract a wind turbine manufacturer. We had 1,200 members making wind turbines in a brownfield site that was now rebuilt. When the governor left office, the new governor decided he didn't need that renewable energy standard and ignored it. Those 1,200 jobs are gone. Plants are closed and they moved on. We need to have a national grid that is a smart grid nationally. We need to have a national energy standard. We need to have a whole bunch of things so that if industry is going to come in, we have long-term strategy. We don't need a 2-year infrastructure program. We need a 20-year infrastructure program. And as long as we've only got 2 years, I can tell you no one's going to invest in it because it takes a year and a half to get a mill up and running. So.
And that's a big issue for companies and for the country, because we are seeing a deterioration in our infrastructure that we need to support, because it is what drives manufacturing and basically economic wealth of the nation. And that infrastructure is more than just the physical infrastructure. In many ways, it's around supply chain, something near and dear to my heart, where I've spent most of my career thinking about supply chains. And I have to say, moving them out of China, moving them to China and back from China too. So I'm guilty on that one. But I am making up for it. So Philip, you're
probably have a long ways to go if you were there.
Yeah. But Philip, you are one of the leading supply chain experts. Let's hear about your perspectives on the regional assets and how they contribute to our national wealth.
Not quite, but I'll try and suggest some thoughts. An earlier panel with the representatives of GE and PPG and Lockheed Martin spoke about the importance of stable and reliable supply chains and the need for transparency and partnership, and the importance of predictability in the funding streams for those second, third, and fourth tier companies. And historically, our regional manufacturing ecosystems, if you will, our industrial commons, relied upon a dense network of small firms that provided the suppliers, that were the suppliers for the large vertically integrated companies. What's happened, and President Gerard alluded to this in his comments, over the last quarter century, there's been an outsourcing of manufacturing activity around the world, and with that has gone our supply base, which has become significantly degraded. What we find talking to companies that are interested in reshoring and reinvesting in our manufacturing sector, their two major needs are workforce, skills development, and a robust and a skilled supplier network and flexible supplier network. So from a regional perspective, in order to support support the momentum that we've seen, take advantage of low energy costs and the technology coming out of our universities and national labs such as Oak Ridge, we need to develop strategies that can restore our small manufacturing base. So there is some promise. So there are some federal assets. I'm responsible within NIST for the Hollings Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program. It's a $130 million program with 60 centers in 50 states, 1,300 technical experts who provide high-level consulting, not quite perhaps at the caliber of BCG, but we charge less for
on-the-ground consulting
for smaller firms, for which there really is no effective private market, and we have enough. So there's a well-established quarter-century national federal network that works with 30,000 companies a year, and through that network we are piloting a number of modest efforts to support regional supply chains in aerospace, transportation, auto and food processing, and also support very special initiatives. So we were a funder of the Blue-Green Alliance that President Gerard mentioned, which was very successful in developing new products and new markets for existing companies. The challenge I would put to all of us is we really need to develop a strategy for doing this on a national basis that involves labor, companies, the private sector, federal government. Jason Miller spoke to the President's National Network of Manufacturing Innovation Institutes. The AMP committee that Dr. Parker mentioned has strongly endorsed that and will be issuing a report, I believe, later this week, which reinforces that. But I think it's fair to say that unlike that framing, there's no equivalent theory of the role of the federal government in supporting regional supply chains. We have assets on the ground, we have some promising pilot projects, but there's really no supply chain caucus in the Congress or an intellectual focus at the national level in terms of policy. That's a challenge that this audience is particularly suited to help us address.
Great, thank you. And Tom, you're lead Oak Ridge National Labs, so we'd like to get a perspective because you have both a federal perspective but also a regional perspective on those assets.
Sure. Well, I think this morning we we heard some of the excitement of the potential associated with new technologies, high-performance computing, advanced materials, advanced manufacturing. And those are all activities that are, not just in research labs, they're propagating out into the marketplace. And I think, those research institutions, be they federal research institutions, universities, we heard a bit about NIST, also exist in the regions. They have locations, they have surroundings in terms of the business climate and what particular areas of strength there may be. And we're certainly very interested in finding ways that we can actually benefit from that regional character. It's something that's probably going to be enabled by some of the things that we heard about this morning. Assistant Secretary Danielson mentioned a voucher program. Mechanisms like that can assist. I think it can be most impactful, particularly when you're talking about small and medium-sized enterprises. We do a lot of work with big companies like the Lockheed Martins and the GEs, and of course they'll have corporate R&D enterprises. They know how to work with universities and labs. For smaller companies, it can be much more difficult. They may not have the luxury of a corporate R&D enterprise, and in fact, they may find that just about everyone does just about everything. And dealing with a large research institution can be complicated, and so having someone nearby that you can talk to and get to know can be very helpful. And one of the ways we've been exploring that recently was with something called the Manufacturing Demonstration Facility. It's focused on additive manufacturing and also some of the new materials that we're trying to bring into that sort of a process. And it's a place where companies can understand whether or not this has a place in their process, how well it will work, what kind of new design possibilities are enabled without encountering the very high barriers to entry just associated with the capital cost. And so I think that's one example. The other thing that we've been trying to explore is working with our local community colleges. When you talk about either additive manufacturing or advanced carbon fiber composites, there's a skill set there that is, it's not just different from what people learned in school 30 years ago. It's different from what people learned in school 5 years ago. And so having programs in the educational system that can respond in fairly real time to those new technologies is important, and I think it's something where we can't just rely on the community colleges to have that infrastructure. In some cases, it's pretty expensive, pretty specialized, and there's going to have to be partnerships with both federal institutions and with industry in order to make those tools available to students as part of their educational process.
Thank you, Tom. I think one of the key assets that we have as a nation is our governors. And right now our governors are spending a lot of time trying to attract, because of the competitiveness of the U.S. now, trying to attract foreign companies or even domestic companies to move to their states. How can we engage the governors better to be able to achieve the goals, to be able to make sure we have the capabilities in place so that they can also thrive and maybe have a little bit less competition?
Well, I think we need to catch up with the governors. So the states' laboratories of democracy have been pioneering in tech-based economic development since the late 70s, the early 1980s. I think President Gerard knows about the great work that was done in Pennsylvania under the governors, starting as far back as Governor Thornburg and continuing through every governor, regardless of political stripe in the subsequent 30 years. What I think is really positive about the last several years, and the Department of Energy certainly exemplifies this, is the marriage of the mission-oriented federal agencies, the scientific agencies, such as DOE and NIST and the Department of Defense, with the regional strategies, the regional economic development strategies of the states and localities. And that's been long overdue. It's very promising. There's enormous leverage if we can marry those two things together. And I think if, with a more robust partnership between the federal and the state level, we will begin to chip away a bit at this really invidious race to the bottom of competitive states with tax breaks.
Right, it's getting very expensive for the country. Leo, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I think it's important that we find a way to work with governors so that we can drive a infrastructure program across the nation. And one of the challenges is that when we talk about infrastructure, many people don't know what it is. It's not just roads and bridges and airports that we seem to always be talking about. It's retrofitting our schools. It's industrial retrofitting. It's all of those things.
ICT.
Close to 60% of the schools in America are more than 50 years old. If you go to the public buildings, more than 50% of the public buildings are more than 75 years old. So once you start retrofitting those things as part of an infrastructure program, along with roads and bridges and water treatment plants and whatnot, you can do that through partnerships of the federal government and the state governments. And then you can also, at the state level, start demanding that there be much more domestic content and looking at how we will do that and giving long-term strategies. I really get annoyed when you hear that we're going to pass an infrastructure bill for the next 2 years. I mean, that's just nuts. And we need a 20-year strategy, a 25-year strategy, and start with all of that kind of stuff. I live in Pittsburgh, which is pretty cool, 6-time Super Bowl champs and all that jazz. but you know, and but every year in Pittsburgh in the winter, we have a pipe break downtown.
Yeah.
And the downtown floods, and they shut it down for anywhere from 1 to 3 days while they fix it.
Right.
Some of those pipes are 100 years old. Just putting that strategy in place, and we can do that through partnerships of the municipalities, the state government, and the feds. But we need a government that at least more than one party is talking about fixing the infrastructure.
Exactly.
I think Phil hit on a good point. I think the federal agencies can do more to encourage regional economies to work together across state lines. Because one of the issues we've got is the governors can, in fact, move on their own. They don't have a deadlock in their legislatures the same way that our federal agencies do for a number of our key issues. So they move out ahead. And so we have Indiana competing against Michigan, when in fact the US is really competing against China.
Exactly.
Right? We have Indiana or Illinois competing with Minnesota, when really we're all competing against Stuttgart. So we need to figure out how to work better with the federal agencies to get some of those regional economies that are, in fact, cross-border, cross-state border economies working well. The Department of Commerce has done some interesting work around clusters, right? Where they really look at regional economies that are supply chain based, that are asset infrastructure based, that are self-contained on a regional basis. And when you start doing the analysis of what those look like, very many of them cross state lines. We've got the auto sector that crosses over into India and Ohio. We've got the food sector that crosses from Minnesota all the way around the Great Lakes because of how the raw materials for the food products industry move around. So we need some federal incentives to work across state lines so that our regional economies are more robust.
And I think that's one of the good things about the way our country works, because we are not state-focused in a sense. We all come from states, but the federal government does have a substantial ability to do that, and so we should be better at crossing those state lines.
We should be better than we are.
Yes.
And I think some of it comes from a governor can in fact get things done on behalf of their own constituents in their own state. And they are not waiting for federal policy to lead. They are working on their schools. They are working on their infrastructure. They are working on their economic development strategies. And they have to do it at the state level because that's all they've got to work with.
Right, and they also want to be reelected. Annette, you were going to...
Yeah, they want to be reelected, yeah.
Sorry, Annette,
if we're not afraid to tell the truth, when I hear these comments about the states working together and the federal government working together, I can't help but be brought back to when the president wanted to advance high-speed rail, and that the Department of Transportation brought companies in to say, we want to do high-speed rail. Can you make these products? And we have a multi-year program. And you got one state that says yes, and the next state says no. So how far is your high-speed rail going to go? and we've got to find ways to understand that we got to try and get some of the ideological knuckleheads out of the system.
I just want to talk a little bit about a really big issue that I think is being addressed nationally, and I do believe that states can level the playing field, and that's talent development. We know, and Phillip, you mentioned earlier about the lack of skills and what needs to happen to make sure we have a skilled workforce going forward. Because over the years, schools have moved away from offering the type of programs that train the future workforce for many of the employers. When we sat on the AMP committee, we know we have strong engineering schools, but we've lost that skilled, hands-on, middle-skilled job development here in the U.S. The strategy that came out of the President's initiative is to make sure that we're all using the national portable, stackable credentials. That's a playing field, and every state's going to compete on the skill development that they have in their state. And so we can all do that together. Minnesota's making sure that we have the skills there that it's going to be attractive for our employers, whether they're big or whether they're small. You know, I mentioned 3M earlier, but I have a small tool and die company in one of my towns, MRG Tool, that need the same skills. And so our bigger employers and our smaller employers are all working together on this initiative to make sure that Minnesota advances and to make sure we have you know, technicians as well as engineers for the future. So that's pretty exciting, and I think that that's something that we can all agree on. In my prior job, I supported a National Center of Excellence in advanced automotive manufacturing in 12 states. What they could all agree on, they compete on their products, but not on their workforce.
Right. Which is fantastic. Unfortunately, we're out of time. The panel, I'm sure, would like to stay for another hour and continue the discussion, but lunch is served, I think, coming up, so looking forward to see you all at lunch.